Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to Billy Martell's Vlogmas. This is the anniversary of the premiere of the first episode of Doctor Who today, and I thought I'd take a minute to talk about it because it's one of my favorite science fiction franchises of all time. Talking about classic Doctor Who, there's just this sort of great sense of imagination and freewheeling creativity that goes with the show. The show goes all over the place over the course of its 20-something year run, and it's not a surprise to me that so many people have tried to keep it going since then. Uh, I I'm just a huge fan of the universe that they created, a universe where it feels like anything can happen. Most often, bad things. There's usually an element of horror to Doctor Who, which is another reason why I love it so much, because I'm such a big horror nerd. As you can tell from the past couple of years, the only videos that I've really produced being in October. Uh, I'm a huge horror nerd, and I love the crazy things that Doctor Who has managed to make me scared of. And for those who don't know much about Doctor Who out there, uh, just missed when it was super popular a couple of years ago and just never got into it for whatever reason. If you're at all interested in it now, or want to know what it's about, and haven't clicked off the video yet, the show is about this character named the Doctor. The title is just a joke. It's a long running joke about how we don't know what his name is. So Doctor Who. That's the joke of the title. Um, but he's just called the Doctor, and he's this alien scientist. Comes from a planet called Gallifrey, and he's part of a race that call themselves the Time Lords. He's not like a Vulcan or a special kind of slug or anything. He's just called a Time Lord. They call themselves that because they're incredibly pretentious, and because they have mastered time travel. Now, they have a strict rule of non interference when it comes to time travel, which basically means they have time travel and then they don't use it. Over the course of the series, of course, you find out they secretly do use it for conspiratorial means. But as far as a doctor, just a normal citizen of the planet Gallifrey, knows, they don't use it. They just sit around thinking, isn't it great that we invented time travel? So the doctor decides to steal an older version of their time machine. The time machine that they have is called TARDIS, which is an abbreviation of its full name, Time and Relative Dimension in Space. The time machine is this great machine that can turn itself, its outward appearance, to look like anything it wants. It can transform itself to look like a dresser, an old grandfather clock, or when it lands in 1960s London, back when the show first premiered, it turns itself into a police box, which back in the day in London in the 60s, the police box was this very common item that you would see on the streets all over the place in London. It was just a special type of phone booth used specifically in emergencies to call the police. And nowadays, you only ever see it in Doctor Who, so it's weirdly become this very sort of iconic Doctor Who element, even though back in the day, the reason why they chose it as the form of the time of the TARDIS was because it was everywhere. It was a bit of a joke. So it turns into a police box when it lands in London. But when you go inside of it, again, the outside is just a disguise. When you go inside of it, it's actually this huge ship, bigger on the inside even than the Starship Enterprise. And it's a time and relative dimensions in space. It's bigger on the inside. It can travel anywhere in space and time, but it happens to land on Earth, and that's when the adventure really starts. Because every couple of years, every couple of seasons, a new character will be introduced. The Doctor gets these companions, these humans That's just the fandom name for them. These human characters who, by accident or by happenstance, or sometimes just because of stubbornness, end up getting let onto the TARDIS and traveling with the Doctor and becoming his friend for a while he travels the universe. Essentially, someone that he can explain things to. But originally, a quest across the universe to just explore and see what there was to see, and to not be so bored anymore from the Doctor, eventually becomes, through the sort of influence of his human friends, it becomes an adventure to save people. Essentially, the Doctor becomes a superhero over the course of the series. Especially in the early episodes, you see that he's a very sort of crusty, very grumpy kind of erudite character, just as pretentious as the other Time Lords, just a little bit pissier. And his human companions insist on helping people and making things better wherever they go. They see someone in danger, they have to protect them. And that rubs off on the Doctor over time. And over the course of the series, he becomes this incredible, heroic figure. He gets to a point where, at the end of the original series, he becomes so good at time travel and setting and facing off against all these horrible enemies that he has throughout the universe, all these terrible alien races that he defeats on a regular basis. He becomes so good at it that the seventh Doctor becomes almost terrifying. He's like this Machiavellian manipulator who just happens to be on the side of good most of the time. And when it comes to the seventh Doctor, the show's been running since the 60s. So the character of the Doctor has had to be recast several times. So because he's an alien, the show came up with this great idea that the Doctor is nearly immortal. The Time Lords not only develop time travel, they also develop this method of staying immortal, where every time one of their bodies is about to die, their body just regenerates. It reshuffles all of it restarts its life and reshuffles all of its DNA and everything about it until it comes out looking quite different, and often acting quite different as well, because it's now a different actor's interpretation of the character. It's an interesting science fiction concept that has been played around with quite a bit. And so because of that, there are several different Doctors. There have been, I think, 14 at this point. 14 Doctors, including not including some unofficial Doctors that have been shown here and there as like potential future incarnations of the Doctor or potential past incarnations of the Doctor. And everyone has their favorites. And since it is Doctor Who Day, I managed to find a list that I sent to someone who recently asked me what were good episodes to hunt out and watch from Doctor Who. Because the show is so huge and long and so daunting of a task, what would be something good for them to start with? So I decided to send them a very brief list of like maybe 1 or 2 episodes from each era of the show. So if we go back to the 1960s, and this list applies to anybody, these are my recommendations for everyone. Going back to the 60s, one of my favorite episodes from the classic run of the show is Dalek Invasion of Earth. The Daleks are the biggest bad of the series. They're an alien race that premiered in the 2nd episode, and they're essentially the Klingons of the show. They are the biggest enemy that the Doctor faces on a daily basis, and they are incredibly popular over in England. They have a very silly design where they have like a plunger for a hand, very 50s or 60s science fiction, but very fun enemies. And they're essentially an alien version of the Nazi Party, so very prescient nowadays to watch. And essentially, this episode, they invade Earth, and the Doctor arrives after they've already successfully invaded Earth, and has to try and uh, fight them off after they've already won. Essentially, it's a very, very dark episode, and it's great for showing how Doctor Who rides the line between super goofy and camp and super dark and depressing at the same time. Another great episode, this one featuring the second Doctor, who's my personal favorite Doctor, Tomb of the Cybermen, which is just a fun, classic horror romp. The Cybermen are also a very popular enemy in the show, and this one is essentially just a mummy story, but with Cybermen. These space archaeologists find a space pyramid with space mummies inside, and it turns out the mummies are actually Cybermen. And they, of course, being robot people, because Cybermen are cyborgs, they're part robot, part people, they come to life and start wrecking shit. Another one of my favorite episodes of all time, War Games. This is the last episode that Patrick Troughton, the second Doctor, was in. It's the longest surviving episode of the show, so if you're going to watch that one, get ready for a sit. It's about 5 hours long, but it's one of the most effective anti-war science fiction stories I've ever seen. It's got some really hilarious stuff, but it's also got some really heady science fiction concepts to it. It's just fantastic. Then the 70s, things changed up quite a bit. The tone of the show changed up quite a bit. For a while, because of budgetary constraints, the Doctor was actually trapped on Earth for a while, and they turned him into sort of a James Bond, proto-Austin Powers kind of a figure. First, there's Spearhead from Space, which is just a classic episode. That's where the Autons came from. The Autons, for those who aren't in the know, are an alien race that lives in plastic. So essentially, it's an excuse for store mannequins to come alive and attack you, which is absolutely terrifying. And Spirit from Space is fantastic. Terror of the Autons is the second episode where they showed up, and also a classic. But it also introduces my favorite Doctor Who bad guy, the Master, who was created to be like the Dr. Moriarty to the Doctor Sherlock Holmes. And he's not ever been a very successful villain. But just like how I really enjoy how the Doctor's character arc has gone over the course of the series, I also really enjoy how the character arc of the Master has sort of mirrored his character arc over the course of the show. There's also an episode called Curse of Peladon, which is one of my first episodes when it came to watching Doctor Who. Actually, Curse of Peladon I have great nostalgic fondness for, but it's essentially a Star Trek episode in Doctor Who. The Doctor ends up on a planet where there's all sorts of space politics going on, and he has to mediate between the different parties. It's kind of like a 1970s version of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but with a Doctor in it. The Three Doctors is the first crossover episode where previous actors to have played the Doctor show up and do a team-up episode with the current actor playing the Doctor. Essentially, the Doctor, as a time traveler, meeting himself at different points of his life, but with the added bonus that you get to see the different actors who have played the Doctor interacting with each other and getting into squabbles. So the Three Doctors, as the first time that they did this, very silly episode, but in my opinion, one of the best episodes of the series, and also the best time that they ever did the team up. They've done team ups since then that have been great, but in my opinion, it never got better than that first time. Genesis of the Daleks is an episode featuring Tom Baker, the fourth Doctor, which is most people's favorite classic Doctor. He's the one with the scarf that you've probably seen. Genesis of the Daleks is a very intense episode, very famous, very infamous episode. It's essentially the classic time traveler problem of, if you have time travel, should you go back and stop 9/11? Should you go back and kill baby Hitler? In this instance, the Doctor is given the opportunity, and in fact the orders by his Time Lord masters, to go back in time and stop the Daleks from ever existing. They've caused too much problems, caused too many problems. The Doctor has to go back and kill the Daleks before they ever exist. So you get to see the Daleks' creator, Davros, who is a great character in his own right, and you also get to see all this other horrible stuff that happened that led to the Daleks' creation, and it gets pretty intense. Pyramids of Mars is a personal favorite of mine, where the Doctor gets to fight. Again, there are mummies in this episode, but more importantly, the Doctor fights Sutek, an ancient Egyptian deity, and the ethics of who the Doctor is and why he is are explored. Why he does what he does, and how time is a little bit more fluid than the show had referenced earlier. Before, there was this rule that history could never be changed, but the Doctor reveals that he lied. A lot of plot points in this series are explained away as the Doctor lying, but when they want to do something different later on. But he reveals that actually history can change, and so it is what the Doctor does is very important, because he is actually changing the world every time he does that. This episode is also super dark and extremely depressing, and I love it. I love stuff like that. People in my personal life think that I'm very twisted because of how much I love twisted, depressed, horrifying shit. 80s Doctor Who. 80s Doctor Who got way more campy towards the beginning of the series, but it got a little bit darker towards the end. But starting right off with one of the silliest, City of Death, which is an episode written by Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Fantastic episode, fantastic writer. The bad guy from Indiana Jones 3 is in it as an immortal alien unstuck from time trying to steal the Mona Lisa. John Cleese has a cameo, who, even though more recently has turned a little bit ugly online, was still very funny back in the day. And as I said, it was written by Douglas Adams. Next episode that I recommended here is Caves of Androzani, which is the only episode that I usually recommend to first-timers for Peter Davidson. Peter Davidson was the fifth actor to play the Doctor. And in my opinion, his performance, combined with the writing that was being offered during his run on the show, made it one of the less good eras. I am in the minority. A lot of people really love Peter Davidson, and I think that he did a great job after he did his run on the show. He ended up doing a series of Doctor Who audio dramas where I think he did a fantastic job. But when he was on TV, not the best era of the show, in my personal opinion. Not necessarily his fault entirely. He was a much younger actor than had ever played the part, so he was like kind of learning the ropes as he was doing it. But by the end of the show, he had gotten it down to a science. Unfortunately, the writing of the show was still pretty silly. But the last episode that he ever did, Caves of Androzani, is the one I'm recommending here. Absolutely genius episode. One of the best written, one of the best acted, one of the best directed episodes of the entire series, of the entire franchise. Absolutely fantastic. And then here is where I have to sort of give a sort of disclaimer. I'm not recommending any episodes starring Colin Baker, the Sixth Doctor, for newcomers. This is because Colin Baker's era was fraught with production issues and ended up being a very sort of mixed bag of a season that's very difficult for even longtime fans of Doctor Who to get into, much less newcomers. It's a very mixed bag of quality. It's mostly pretty bad stuff. Not because of the actors or even some of the writers involved. It was just a perfect storm of production hell at the time, and it didn't go very well. Colin Baker is actually one of my favorite Doctors. Well, actually, I love all the actors who have played the Doctor, but I love Colin Baker especially, partially because his era on the show was so complicated. And I definitely recommend you checking out any of the audio dramas that he also produced, or not produced, he didn't produce them, but he also starred in later on. He's still doing them to this day. So is Peter Davidson, so are a lot of the doctors, and he's absolutely fantastic. I think that his audios are usually, not always, but usually much better than almost any other Doctor Who audio drama you could listen to. So I definitely recommend him. And it's gotten much darker since I started reading this list, so I'm going to turn on my little tungsten lamp over there. And I'm going to recommend one episode from the seventh Doctor, Sylvester McCoy, who was the last Doctor of the original series. Um, Again, lots of production issues during his time, but at a certain point, the higher ups cared so little about the show that they just let the show happen and then canceled it. And during those last couple episodes where no one is really watching the clock, no one's really watching to make sure they do certain things a certain way. The younger writers who were working on the show managed to make it into something really interesting. It's not my favorite era of the show, but it is really interesting. And it's also the favorite era of the show of one of my favorite YouTubers, Linkara. And my favorite episode of that run is an episode called The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, where the Doctor encounters an evil circus. So you have lots of great horror and science fiction and Lovecraftian shit going on with that. But on top of that, the episode is also a meta commentary on how the show isn't as good as it once was, but they keep going anyway, sort of a thing. And yeah, the show was canceled immediately after that season. Then we go into the early 2000s. The show came back in 2005. There was a movie that came out in between the end of the original show and the beginning of the new show that is considered canon, but it is really bad. It features Paul McGann, who also went on to do a series of much better audio dramas, which I also recommend. But the movie that he was initially in is really, really bad, and I can't recommend it, unfortunately. But once you watch all this other stuff, if you're into Doctor Who at that point, then you can start watching the bad stuff, because once you love something, you're a little bit more willing, in my experience, to give it a chance when it's really bad. One of the very first episode of the modern series, I definitely recommend Rose. It's a reintroduction to the audience of the Doctor and his universe. There's a common thing that you'll hear among fans called saying "Don't skip 9." The ninth Doctor only lasted one season. It's a very uneven season, but in my opinion, it's great. And this episode in particular is just bloody fantastic. It features the return of the Autons, very classic, fun Doctor Who adventure, very tongue-in-cheek, as much of the modern series is. Unfortunately, the modern... classic Doctor Who was campy in an almost unintentional way. Modern day Who is incredibly campy in a very intentional way, and sometimes, like the Sharknado movies, that can kind of backfire. Another great episode from that first season, Dalek, reintroduced the Daleks for the 21st century, and definitely one of the scariest Dalek episodes that's ever been. Daleks are not always scary because they're just such a silly monster design, but they almost managed to pull it off in that first episode. Another episode from the first season, Father's Day, which is a great sort of time travel problem episode. Again, like what would you change if you had the ability to go back in time and change something in your life, and how the Doctor has to convince his companion that's not a good idea, don't change anything about your past. And finally, from season 1, a lot of episodes from season 1. I love season 1. The Empty Child, The Doctor Dances. It's a two-parter, and each part has a different title, but I count them together as one episode. The Empty Child and The Doctor Dances. One of the scariest episodes of Doctor Who ever. Absolutely fantastic episode. It feels like an episode of The Twilight Zone that the Doctor just happened to pop into. And then we go into the most popular Doctor of the modern era, David Tennant. If you want to know why David Tennant is so popular now, it's mostly because of his run on Doctor Who. Great episodes from his run: Blink, is a great episode. It features the Weeping Angels that I mentioned earlier, and unfortunately just doesn't have a lot of the Doctor in it, but it is a fantastic episode. Uh, and that's the only episode of David Tennant's that I recommended to newcomers. Okay. I am not the biggest fan of David Tennant's run. I think it's very goofy, but not because of him, just because the writing got very silly. But I really do love Blank. Matt Smith, who played the part in from 2010 onward for a while, uh, one of my favorite episodes in the whole franchise, The Doctor's Wife. I recommend that to everybody. Written by one of my favorite writers, Neil Gaiman. Also, The Rebel Flesh and the Almost People is a fantastic science fiction concept episode of, are clones still people, and what rights should they be allowed to have, and all that sort of thing. The Crimson Horror is a great goofy episode starring one of my favorite actors, Diana Rigg. It's essentially just a tribute to Hammer horror films, which of course I also love. Nightmare in Silver, the other episode written by Neil Gaiman, is more of a fairy tale episode featuring the Cybermen once again. And then the two final episodes feature one of the most recent actors to play the Doctor, Peter Capaldi, who, in my opinion, is probably the best actor to have ever played the part. He brings so much nuance to the part. First episode, Robot of Sherwood, which is an episode where the Doctor meets up with Robin Hood in history, the historical Robin Hood. Sounds like a very goofy concept, and it is a very goofy episode, but they play it off super well. And finally, one of the scariest episodes of TV I've seen in quite a while, Knock Knock, starring as the guest star of the episode, another one of my favorite actors, David Suchet. So yeah, no, that's my list of not necessarily my favorite episodes, because I have a lot of episodes, some of which are my favorites that I can't recommend to newcomers because they're just so weird and bizarre. But that's my recommendation for newcomers coming into Doctor Who. It's a bizarre series. It's not for everybody, but like I said, if you do get into it, it's got so much to offer. It's got so many great episodes, so many great comics. I've been getting really into the comics lately, and I'm so into these books. If you're wondering why I didn't recommend any episodes from the most recent Doctor, the 13th Doctor, Jodie Whittaker, the first female Doctor, I am personally not a fan of the stuff the show's doing right now. The show could always win me back at some point. There have been plenty of eras in the show's history that I haven't been as much of a fan of in the past. If it turns out that I end up really liking the show after Jodie Whittaker has left, I'll of course watch the entire Jodie Whittaker era to get myself up to speed for what's going on in the more recent incarnation. But I'm just not a fan of it at the moment. So those are my thoughts on Doctor Who, at least what thoughts I could include into this video. I've already gone way longer than I intended, and way longer than any other video that I've made so far on this. But yeah, I recommend the show, I recommend the audio dramas, I recommend the novels, I recommend the comics. I am absolutely obsessed with Doctor Who, so it's always fun to have a day to celebrate that franchise. Thanks for indulging me. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching me geek out about one of my favorite shows, and I hope that you have a great day. Leave a comment down below if you have a favorite episode of Doctor Who or an episode that you would recommend to a newcomer that I missed, or tell me what your favorite TV shows are and what episodes of those shows you think I should check out to see if I would be a fan. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.